So that's like the starting point, really, that I take in the book, is that there are all these environmental factors and mechanisms that influence our minds, and particularly they influence our children's minds. And it's really, really important for us to take that into account. Like, one of the main reasons why I care so much about this is because I see so many children who get pathologized and end up having a really toxic sense of their own selves. Like, they feel like they're broken or their brains are broken. And they have so much shame about them because they're experiencing these symptoms, which I believe should be understood as a wise response to the world around them. So I really try and bring that perspective into my work, and I brought it into the book. It's just really trying to have a non-pathologizing understanding of our children. My sort of rules around this are, first of all, don't wait for regulation. Like, I think a lot of parents are sort of waiting for the government to tell them that it's not okay for your child to be doing X amount of hours on Y device or platform. And that might come at some point in the near future. But at the moment in the UK, we don't really even have any clear national advice. Like in America, at least, the National Association of Pediatricians has published advice on how much screen time they think is okay for kids at different ages. We don't even have that in the UK. But my suggestion is, don't wait for the regulation to figure out your own solution. The other golden rule that I have is basically no devices in the bedroom, where it's kids who go to their bedrooms in the evenings and they're on their devices. They're connected to this like vast online world where they can come into contact with all sorts of things. So I say to parents, like, you might let your teenage child have a glass of wine or a beer with dinner sometimes, depending on your family orientation, but you wouldn't let them take a bottle of whiskey into the bedroom with them. So I think the same thing does need to apply to devices. Just don't let them have devices in their bedroom after a certain time. Really, I think that's critically important.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the important topic of youth mental health to get ourselves up to date on. Now, there's a lot of polemic about these topics these days. For example, some of the older generation argue that all this focus on mental health is making our young people feel more sensitive and less resilient, while others argue that tech companies are not taking responsibility for their devices and functionalities as a source of decline in youth mental health. So we're going to try and unravel these often divisory issues in an attempted balanced way. We're going to be discussing the importance of threat and safety to a child's state of mind as they develop, the power of the parent or carer's own unresolved issues to transmit onto young people, creating symptoms in the child, the importance of going to the root of the problem rather than just treating the symptoms, the role of escapism as an emotional avoidance strategy, and how digital providers and platforms are taking advantage of this tendency. We're going to discuss the role of shame in us avoiding facing these issues, and so sidestepping the positivity of acceptance and the resilience that comes from that, and the consequences of us overprotecting our children in the real world, but not enough online. And we're also going to discuss the importance of embodied practice and connection to social groups and nature, among a bunch of other stuff. Fortunately, considering the nuanced and potentially triggering topic of the mental health and well-being of our children, the ones that we parent as well as the one we teach, my guest today has just released the paperback version of his new book on exactly this topic. It's called How the World is Making Our Children Mad and What to Do About It. And as a hugely experienced child psychotherapist and founder of the charity A Part of Me, he is perfectly placed to give us an update on all of this. And he's just filled with excellent stories and advice to help us face it. He is, of course, Louis Weinstock, a transpersonal psychotherapist and mindfulness specialist who's worked with a wide range of sufferers from the criminal justice system and drug addicts to homeless people, troubled teens, and their parents. Now, I have been wanting to speak to Louis about his work ever since I first heard his accessible, personal, and compassionate approach to youth mental health. Add to that the fact that this book confronts one of the hardest realities that we face today: how parents and teachers should respond to the massive changes in their children's lives offered by the internet and by devices. And I just couldn't wait any longer. So without further ado, let's go. Louis Weinstock, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on. How are you today?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Yeah, it's been a nice sunny morning here in Manchester, so we're appreciating that.
Great. Now, I'd
Yeah.
love to start, Louis, asking my guests about their childhoods, getting a sense of some of the strongest burning questions that really hit them hard when they first became aware of their own thoughts. Usually sometime between 8 and 12, but it really depends. What seems significant when you look back at your earliest sort of deep burning questions?
Well, I had a strange experience when I was about 10. I was actually had a really stinking cold, and I remember I was in my bedroom. I had like my Spider-Man curtains and all of that kind of stuff. And for some reason, something inside me directed me to sort of sit on the floor in my bedroom and close my eyes. And I started to try and play around like with my breathing because I was just feeling so yucky. And I noticed that, and obviously I don't remember this exactly, but somehow through using my mind in a different way and my breath in a different way, I could slightly alleviate how uncomfortable I felt. And I only really recovered that memory when I was actually training to be a child psychotherapist. Like, it's weird how you sort of remember this stuff that's kind of forgotten or hidden. And then I realized that that was kind of like my first prototype experience of meditation, really. It was like noticing, oh, wow, like my mind can actually have an interesting influence on my body or my relationship with my body. And then I didn't really do anything particularly with that, although I remember at secondary school, we had an amazing RE teacher who taught us meditation in a class on Buddhism, and I was really into that. And then in my early 20s, when I went traveling, I really got into meditation. I studied with different teachers and I went and spent time in different sort of retreats and monasteries. So I guess, yeah, that experience, I reflect back and I think the way I make sense of it is that there is this kind of natural inclination towards these things. So I've ended up teaching children meditation as part of my work, and they're often very curious about the different effects and influences they can have by using their mind in a different way. So I kind of feel like it's in there. It's not like it's something you have to force top down, but there's kind of a natural inclination towards that.
And it's so interesting you discovered that on your own because my bro really helped me with this when I was struggling to sleep. I think I'd watched a film that was too old for me or something, and he came and taught me this and showed me that I could calm my nervous system using breathing in the middle of the night. But to have discovered that on your own is really interesting. That it's obviously intuitively built into us somewhere. This knowledge of this body knowledge, and we're going to be coming back to that in a moment, listeners. So before we get into your marvelous new book, How the World's Making Our Children Mad, about this youth mental health crisis, I just want to set the foundation with a few important ideas that you introduce right from the start in the book, but also from your work in general. So the first point to remember before we start is, as we're going to talk about in more detail in a moment, it's not just the symptoms we need to focus on, but the roots of the problem. And so it may not be the madness of our children we need to address, but the madness of the world around them. As you quote in the book, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment that it's growing in, not the flower, right? So you make this really valid point. The world itself doesn't feel particularly safe. and that we have an unprecedented access now to imagery, to news, to entertainment that really plays on that threat system and the negativity and bias that we've evolved to have to stay safe, to maximize our engagement with media. And that many of those issues, like nuclear war or climate change, are genuinely existential threats for young people to worry about. So despite all of the measures of standard of living slowly rising, obviously not unilaterally across all racial and social groups, but things like access to food, to water, to education, to healthcare, despite that, young people's sense of fear and worry and sadness at the injustices and the threats in the world seems to be growing. So let's start with that, Louis. Can you just tell us about this impossibility of separating people's mental lives from the environment around them, and how our mad world is raising people's collective anxiety and incrementing these adverse mental health scenarios?
Yeah, well, I think that sadly, the sort of main way that we typically have thought about mental health or mental illness in children is quite focused on what's going on inside the child. So, like the rise in psychiatric diagnoses for children that we're seeing is coming from a place where we believe that many things are sort of faulty brain chemistry. That's like quite a strong narrative that's been promoted through different channels, and we can get into that if we want to. But actually, the science is very clear that literally from the moment of conception, like whilst in utero, a fetus, and then when we're born, we are really influenced by the environment. Our brains and our nervous systems are being shaped by the environment continuously. And there's a number of different mechanisms by which that happens. So in utero, for example, there's this scientific concept called fetal programming, which is basically just describing the reality that the fetus is being influenced by the environment in which that mother is living in. And the sort of most obvious example of that came from Holland during the Second World War, where there was a study of a group of mothers who were really struggling to eat because there was a famine. And then they studied their children like years down the line, and they found that these children were primed in their mother's wombs to have a very thrifty metabolism. And they had all sorts of other secondary problems as well. But essentially, these children were being primed in the womb for a world where there would be little food to eat. So this incredible intelligence, I think, that's like the tuning into the environment, and it's preparing this child for a world. Now, obviously, that's not always helpful, because these children were then dealing with this thrifty metabolism in a world where there was actually enough food for them to eat. So they had problems associated with that. So that's like the starting point, really, that I take in the book, is that there are all these environmental factors and mechanisms that influence our minds, and particularly they influence our children's minds. And it's really, really important for us to take that into account. Like, one of the main reasons why I care so much about this is because I see so many children who get pathologized and end up having a really toxic sense of their own selves. Like, they feel like they're broken or their brains are broken, and they have so much shame about them because they're experiencing these symptoms, which I believe should be understood as a wise response to the world around them. So I really try and bring that perspective into my work, and I brought it into the book. It's just really trying to have a non-pathologizing understanding of our children and their
I've got a
responses to the world.
I've got a whole question about that, so we'll come back to that in a moment, Louis. So another fascinating perspective you offer right from the start is that many of children's adverse feelings and behaviors seem to clear up as soon as we, their caregivers, integrate some of our own adverse experiences. And to explain this, you use this lovely analogy of the forest and the clearing. That the clearing represents the parts of ourselves that we feel uncomfortable, we're comfortable showing to the rest of the world, whereas the forest is where we hide the parts of ourselves that we don't love and we kind of want to disown, potentially hiding them so well that we lose them and just forget that they were ever part of us. So similarly, Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, that we don't become, if we don't become aware of those parts we're ashamed of, then we tend to pick up those features in other people, and often in the children that we're taking care of, in a sort of shadow projection. And listeners, we've got a whole episode with Dr. James Hollis on the shadow, if anyone wants to go really, really deep into that. Now, Jung called this work on our shadow a social responsibility, but he said particularly towards the children we care for, so as not to pass on our own shame complexes. And you echo that in the book, explaining that more and more when parents come to you worried about their children's mental health, you start the process by working on the parents' own unresolved complexes. Now, tell us how, as a child psychologist, you came to this approach of completely trusting the young person's issues to resolve simply by mirroring their parents after they've done that work themselves.
Yeah, well, in my original training, and actually for a large part of my working life, I was focused primarily on working with children and young people directly. So, for example, I used to run a therapeutic school for teenagers in London who'd experienced complex trauma. And in that case, these children had experienced so many different traumatic events and had grown up with like levels of neglect and abuse that it was actually quite difficult to work with their families, was the truth. So in some situations, it's not actually possible or feasible to do much transformative work with the parents. There's just not that availability or capacity there. But then I did my psychotherapy training and I was working with a mixture of parents and families and children. But what I found ultimately is that you can see a child like once a week and you do your session and they can really feel safe in the session and things get processed using the different sort of creative therapeutic modalities that we use. But then ultimately, and it's so obvious to say, that they go back into the same environment. And so I just started to realize that the impact that I could have on these children was limited if I was just working with them alone. So I just started to shift and work more with parents. And then I started to meet, I mean, really, it was meeting more parents who were open to this possibility that by working on themselves, it would have a knock-on effect on their children. It's not, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of obvious, but unfortunately, what I've seen quite a lot in my time is a lot of parents, and it's no fault of their own. They're very stressed and they're quite defended against, their own
And it's
stuff.
shadow projection. They may not
Yeah.
care that that's inside them.
They might not be aware that's inside them, and so ultimately, what they often would do is say, "Here's my child. Please, will you fix him or her?" And that just, if I was to just keep going with that, that's just sustaining the shadow projection. So started working more with parents and started to notice that actually, as parents were willing to look inside themselves and look at the places in themselves that had been pushed into the forests, the analogy that I use in the book, and they started to integrate some of those elements of themselves, then it just had a knock-on effect on the child. The child got better without the parent necessarily needing to do anything differently at all. And very often, what I found is that when a referral came to me for a child who was starting to struggle at a particular age, and I asked the parents about the parents about what was happening with them at that age, very often one of the parents would say, "Oh, well, when I was 9, let's say, that's when my dad died from a suicide." And it was just
Wow.
a strange thing. I can't explain it necessarily scientifically yet, but I've seen it repeatedly enough as a pattern that I think there's something there. Like there's something that gets frozen in time. Like even in my own story, like my dad's, it's weird because on Father's Day recently, I randomly bumped into this older lady when I was picking up my daughter, and she just said, "Who are you and what's your name?" So I said, I'm Louis Weinstock, and she said, "Oh, I recognize that name. Like, where did you grow up?" I said, "I grew up in North Manchester." She said, "Oh, I think your granddad was my teacher in school, and it was so tragic when he died." just a weird coincidence because it was Father's Day. And anyway, the story is that my dad's dad, who was a teacher at a school, died tragically, had a heart attack in a swimming pool when my dad was 14. And I've always wondered why, when I was 14, like I came from a fairly stable family overall, middle class. There wasn't really any obvious traumas in our family. But age 14, I really did go quite off the rails. And I'm sure there's always multiple factors and explanations for this on top of being an adolescent. But I really believe now that when I was 14, suddenly my dad didn't have the template of how to be a dad because that was gone for him. And so at 14, I started to go off the rails, and I feel like I was sort of living out my dad's own unresolved grief. So when his dad died, he also went completely off the rails. Like, people didn't know what to do with him. So yeah, it just started to make more sense to me that these kind of things repeat until we are willing to meet them with what they need.
Well, Louis, that's a really difficult thing to look into scientifically. So if you do come across any studies over the next few years, do please get back in touch, because I think that's something very, very interesting to study. And regarding this question of mirroring after you've done the work yourself, it's something myself and my wife did when we had a bit of a crisis with our boy, and we saw immediate results without our boy having had any treatment whatsoever. So it can definitely vouch for that approach, guys. It really, really works. Now, one
Yes.
of the hardest things about parenting is not to call out off-track behavior in young people in a way that shames them, but to remain loving. Now, already young people tend to narrativize everything that's going on in their family and in their social groups around them as somehow their fault. Jung called the shame the soul killer. I mean, tell us what the role of shame is in young people's mental health, and how parents need to act to kind of not exacerbate that as they're trying to help sort of draw attention to some negative behaviors.
Yeah, shame is such an interesting emotion, I find, and particularly in therapeutic encounters, I find it's very like slippery. I think I describe it as a slippery emotion. I think it's almost designed to be slippery because shame is essentially emotion that is about hiding ourselves or hiding parts of ourselves. And my understanding of the evolution of shame, and obviously with evolutionary psychology, it's often a little bit speculative, like we don't really know, but things can make sense, right? So the theory that I feel makes sense is that we are social creatures ultimately, and human beings survived by being in tight groups that were able to protect each other. And if you as a, if you as a part of a tribe were going to do something that's made you stand out from the group, like wearing something different, making a different noise, or veering off away from the tribe, that would put potentially the whole tribe at risk. So it feels, a sensible theory that shame evolved as this very, very powerful emotion that keeps us connected to the tribe, so we don't stand out from the tribe too much. And it's interesting that we have words in the language like mortified, which comes from the Latin root word mort, which means death. So I really think shame is such a powerful emotion because it kind of is protecting us from a perceived death. And in this case, it's the death of social rejection. So that's kind of like my background theoretical orientation towards shame, if that makes sense.
And there's a lot of
Uh,
research. We saw this in the negativity bias episode, listeners, that shows that we're more worried about not looking like idiots to the tribe than we are about proving ourselves to be useful. So there is definitely this concept of being at risk to the group, definitely.
yes. And then how it develops over time. So I mean, just thinking about my own daughter, something that happened yesterday that I was really shocked by. So my daughter's 6. And I was taking her into school, and I honestly think this was the first time this ever happened. But before we went into school, she said, "Daddy, have I got any food around my mouth?" She's never asked that before. Like, very often she'll go into a scenario, she could have like chocolate or whatever she's been eating all over her face and just didn't care at all. And suddenly she started to care. And as a parent, I'm like, oh no, this is like that self-consciousness like kicking in. And I can see how it comes, because in the playground now, she started to describe situations where kids will say things that are creating a self-consciousness. For example, she told me last week that she was practicing handstands and cartwheels with her friends, and this boy in her year group said something about her knickers, like silly knickers or something like that. So then she came home and wanted us to buy her some like black shorts instead to wear under her summer dress, which I just thought was like so sad, really. But that is just how things work. We grow up and develop in groups, and people say things, don't they? And so I think that's again just another nod towards the environmental social conditioning of these kind of emotions.
What about the parenting side, where we're looking for ways that we can draw attention to those useful advices, without it becoming a soul killer, as Jung put it?
Yeah, what do you mean, like drawing attention to the
Well, like
useful?
we want to be able to correct certain behaviors, saying that's not
Yes.
appropriate.
Yeah.
We as parents, we need to do this on a regular basis. There's all kinds of off-track behavior.
Yes.
We need to somehow
Yeah.
call out. But the question is, how do you do that lovingly and hold the limit without creating a complex?
Well, I think first thing to say is it's tricky. The second thing to say is just being aware of shame as a thing and noticing it in your children is like super important, as well as becoming aware of it in yourself. I think it's extremely important, like coming back to the idea of parents doing the work on themselves, that we're aware of our own shame. Like, what are the parts of ourselves that we are embarrassed about, and how might we project that also onto our children? And then I think just like practically, if our child is doing something that we want to correct, the most obvious thing is that we really have to focus on correcting the behavior and not make it about them as a person. So, like, really the pathologizing shame-based language and shame, sorry, we should really say, I don't know if you've done this on your podcast before, but the distinction between shame and guilt is important. Shame is typically understood as being a sense that there's something about you that's not right that you need to hide. Whereas guilt is a more cognitive emotion, where we can say in guilt, like, oh, I've done something wrong. Whereas shame typically is the feeling that I am wrong. So in parenting, that translates as saying, when you punch that boy in the playground, that specific behavior wasn't appropriate. Instead of saying, you're too boisterous, or you are, replace that with whatever adjective you want, which then makes it about them as a person rather than specifically about that behavior. So separating those things out, I think, is really important. And then the other thing, which is super important, is the rupture and repair stuff. So shame is inevitable. I don't think we can actually avoid shame. And I think that's like a good starting point. But what we can do when we've done any kind of intervention with our children where there might be shame, or maybe they've run away to hide in a corner, is at the right time after that rupture, we do the repair. And the science shows, and parents typically, when I do my workshops or whatever, they love hearing this, is it doesn't actually matter how many ruptures you have in your relationship in a day, as long as you are consistent in repairing those ruptures in a loving, non-shaming way, actually teaches the children that conflict in relationship is bearable and repairable. And that's like such a critical thing to learn in life. And we can talk about what those repairs look like, but essentially it's just, you know, and you have to wait until the child's ready. You can't force it on them, but finding the right moment, and you just have that connection with them. And you might want to say you're sorry. You don't need to force them to say they're sorry, but you really just want to get back into that relational state that most parents will know what that feels like and what that looks like.
Those two brilliant bits of advice there. I imagine there's going to be a few more listeners. This is gold dust. Okay, so still setting the context. What do you think about psychotherapy for young people? We've already touched on it with this question of the mirroring, but I just want to go into detail a little bit about that. apart from those children who have experienced trauma with a big T, so actual life-threatening trauma like abuse or war or accidents that might lead to PTSD without intervention, apart from those sort of extreme cases, do you think it's just better to work with the parents with a view to those mirroring results we just touched on, or at least until the brains are fully formed, perhaps to avoid them developing any of these complexes? Oh, I'm mad, I've got mental health issues, because there's still a taboo around needing therapy, right? Is it a good idea for children to get psychotherapy?
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly, I think more and more young people are therapy open or therapy aware. So I think that taboo is definitely changing. I think what I really want to say, which feels so important to me, and it's been a huge part of my work for the last 15 years, I would say, is that psychotherapy itself is a very limited Western model of how to treat mental health. And there are so many different interventions, so many different factors that support mental health. And I typically am interested in exploring those other factors when we're thinking about children and young people. I'm not saying that psychotherapy can't help, because it definitely can, depending on so many factors around the age of the child, their openness, and the family context, and the cultural background. Um, but we know, like, for example, we know that time spent in nature is an absolutely critical ingredient of child mental health and adult mental health as well. It's an amazing study that I reported in my book about ADHD symptoms. And they found that, and this was quite a large cohort, I think it might have been 10,000 children they studied. They found that 20 minutes spent in any type of nature, even if it's in a local park, reduced ADHD symptoms as effectively as taking a Ritalin-like medication.
That's great.
So, so for
That'll be in the show
me,
notes, listeners. If you want to check that study, that'll definitely be in the show
yeah.
notes.
So for me, my starting point would be to really like look holistically at what's going on before we just jump to, oh, this child needs psychotherapy. It's like, are they getting enough access to nature? How much time are they spending on screens? Like, considering diet is another obvious one. Do they have positive relationships or friendships in school? Because loneliness is another supremely important factor that I spend a lot of time thinking about and developing different programs for. Like, I have a charity which is called A Part of Me, where we help young people who have experienced loss and trauma, and our focus now is very much on reducing loneliness, because all the science shows that loneliness is a predictor of all sorts of mental health problems. It's a predictor of PTSD. So after an adverse experience, if a young person's experiencing loneliness, they're more likely to develop PTSD. It's a predictor of complicated grief after a loss. It's even sadly a predictor of suicide. If a young person experiences a loss and they report feeling lonely after the loss, they're more likely to try and take their own lives. So that's crucial. That's not necessarily an easy problem to solve. There's like social and environmental factors, but I would always really focus on, if I'm working with the parents, for example, like, how could we nurture and support this young person's relationship so they might feel less alone? Sadly, it's not something that gets taught that much. I don't think it gets taught at all, to be honest. Like, those basic social skills, like, how do you actually navigate friendships? Because they can be really tricky, especially when you're an adolescent, right? And sometimes it's not actually rocket science, but it's just like supporting these children or young people in a non-pathologizing way to navigate friendships in a way that they can feel a little bit less alone. That can have a huge impact and improvement on their mental health.
Wow, how interesting that in this case, the psychotherapy we want to apply is all about lifestyle and should definitely be the first port of call, also for adults, I would argue as well. Now, on the
Yeah,
flip side of this discussion is something that you and I have spoken passionately about offline. You quote the psychologist Jonathan Haidt in the book, who's argued that overprotection by parents, sometimes called mollycoddling, leads to a victim-like sensitivity in the kids, and they become this other word that they use, snowflakes, disempowering them, teaching them to be helpless instead of building their sort of basic psychological needs for autonomy and competence. Now, I'm really torn when I hear derogatory terms like this, although there seems to be some truth to Jonathan's point. I mean, do you think there's some risk here to kids' resilience as we become sort of more open to psychotherapy and become a more trauma-aware society?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, there's so many different layers to this. I definitely feel that there is a huge risk of us being too aware of mental health. There was one study in May this year about the increased risk of adolescents developing mental health problems through social networks if some of their friends or connections on those social networks were posting about their mental health diagnoses. So there's more and more studies coming out that show, and it may sound strange to say, that actually awareness of mental health sometimes leads to this condition, which I do describe in the book, where, mental health is not like a broken bone, right? There's no x-ray that shows you, oh, look, this, we can definitely see that there's this thing here that shows that this person or this young person has depression or anxiety. That just doesn't exist. So what that means is the diagnosis is actually more subjective. And if we are walking around with a sort of acute awareness of these potential mental health problems, what can happen? I've noticed it in myself as well, as we can start hypervigilantly scanning our own internal environment, looking for signs that there might be something wrong with us. And that can in itself create it's sort of like that internal co-creation of symptoms that then become a problem. Another example I think it was in 2020. Doctors from Great Ormond Street wrote a letter because they were so worried about the rise in referrals for Tourette's syndrome. They just didn't, they'd never seen such an increase in referrals for Tourette's. And they'd done their research and they'd seen that online there were some particularly big young influencers who had Tourette's who were posting videos of their tics in classrooms. So they had their phone on the desk and they're recording them having these tics. And young people are incredibly sensitive to the information they receive through social networks. So their brains and particular aspects of their defensive mechanisms in their brains just aren't fully developed. So, this information comes in, goes into their brain and nervous system and has like real impacts. And so what we saw through that is like a huge increase in young people who started to experience tics, and they thought that they had Tourette's, and they started referring themselves to doctors and ultimately to the Great Ormond Street. So it's kind of scary to sort of think about that, but it sort of leads obviously to like a really important discussion about how we can protect our children from this kind of stuff.
Yet
Yeah,
another example of the feedback loop where they're completely integrated with their environment and with their communities. Okay.
yeah,
Last bit of context, the stats themselves on youth mental health. So we're seeing a huge rise in the diagnosis of young people with mental health issues, a huge rise in the use of medication to treat those symptoms, often without the psychotherapy necessary because of lack of time to make any change at the root of the problem. In my interview in this series about mental health with the neuroscientist Camilla Nord, she reminds us that we have to take into account that there is more awareness around these topics, as we spoke about just now, that both parents and children are starting to name these symptoms and seeking more help than they did in the past. And that is, of course, feeding these statistics that wouldn't have been there in the past. But she doesn't question the fact that the figures on the rising mental health issues are skyrocketing. I mean, way more than any sort of awareness could account for. So before we get on to the causes and the solutions, what exactly are the study statistics saying around these key diagnoses like depression, anxiety, ADHD, self-harm, and ultimately suicide?
Yeah, well, the person who's doing the most work at the moment into the statistics is obviously Jonathan Haidt, who's got a new book. Can't remember the name of it. Is it called The Anxious Generation?
Anxiety generation. Yeah, the anxious
The Anxiety Generation. But he's got a Substack where he's been for, I think, the last few years publishing like really detailed analyses from around the world about the rise in psychiatric diagnoses and mental health problems for young people. And what he's shown is that since 2009, 2010, there's been a pretty steady rise in depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide in many places around the world. But particularly, and I think this is important and interesting, particularly in Western countries and particularly in individualistic countries. So they really noticed that there is much more of a problem, much more of a rise in countries that veer more towards individualism. We've had a study in the UK. This was in 2021, which showed that 7% of children under 17 had attempted to take their own life in the last year, which is really sad and shocking. We know that in the UK and the USA, about 1 in 4 teenage girls have experienced a depressive episode in the last year. And then we have less information about the rise in ADHD amongst children, but we know more about it in adults. There's been something like a 400% increase in ADHD diagnoses for adults in the last few years. And then autism is on the rise as well. So across the board, I mean, obviously there's different reasons, and these are all different conditions. We can go into the sort of potential explanations for them, but it's quite clear from my own clinical practice and from the research that there's been a really worrying rise in mental health problems and basically psychological suffering for our young people.
Well, thanks. It was just to get a sense of the stats. I mean, it's kind of looking from the Jonathan Haidt websites that it's basically doubled in 15 years, and that's pretty extraordinary. Now, thanks, Louis. With all that context in mind, and by means of sort of introducing the book, I want to start talking about the beautiful structure that you chose to use, following this idea that we need to get to the root of a problem to make any lasting difference. And you break the book up into 7 roots that are driving our children's mental health issues. But as well as that, inspired by another Jungian idea that by transforming that root, we can harvest the fruit from the original negative input, and that this Jungian idea that our greatest sufferings can also be our greatest teachers. So you also give us 7 fruits that can be gathered from this investigative work. Tell us a little bit about the reason why you chose that transformational root to fruit structure for the book.
Yeah, well, the main sort of theory of the book really is that we are only treating the surface level of our children's mental health and that we need to get to the roots. And when we get to the roots, that means looking at sort of what are the deeper psychological and environmental factors that might be leading to this. And particularly the roots are those sorts of factors that typically might exist in the shadows. So we don't necessarily like to look at them or consider them, sort of parts of ourselves that we reject, like narcissism, for example. So I have a chapter on narcissism. Narcissism is one of the root factors that I believe is important to consider that's leading to this rise in child mental health problems. And growing up, there is such a thing as healthy narcissism, where like I use the example in the book of my daughter who's like just learning to ride a scooter around a ramp, and she's just going, look at me. And she's got one leg up. And, we really want people to look at us and love us. And that's just a basic condition of being a human being. We want to be adored. I want to be adored, like the Stone Roses song says. So, but what happens is, depending on our culture, that part of us gets put into the shadows because, nobody really wants somebody to be too narcissistic and to want everybody to look at them. But when it goes too much into the shadow and we don't give that validation that children need, and that's just in a family as well as culturally or socially, then it gets fed in other less healthy ways. And particularly, I think social media is feeding that unhealthy version of narcissism in obvious ways. So that's just giving a specific example of the roots. And then for me, once we tend to these roots, and only once we tend to the roots, like the roots of narcissism, can we then cultivate the fruits, which are kind of like the polar opposite or the other side of the coin. So with narcissism, the opposite of narcissism that I wrote about in the book is about community and cooperation. It's about that capacity that we have for compassion and just like feeling with and being with and caring about other people rather than being focused on ourselves. But in the book, my approach is to say that until we've really taken care of the narcissism bit, we'll never really be able to properly cultivate the root of compassion and community and cooperation. So that's basically the sort of background of the
That
structure.
structure. And
Yeah.
were you influenced by this Jungian idea that, it's something I ask almost all of the psychologists that I get on the podcast. Do you think that suffering is required for transformation? It's a horrific idea because we kind of realize that sometimes you have to go through challenges in order to have something to learn from, to bounce back from. But then we get to this idea that suffering is required, which, has been used as an argument against the existence of God. It seems so sad. And James Hollis said, it'd be hard to find a life without suffering. So maybe it is just required for that kind of transformational bounce. What do you think, Louis?
Yeah, I would agree with James Hollis that suffering is just built into life. So I do a lot of work with grief. And one of the things that I often share is that from the minute we are born, we come out of the womb, and that's the first moment of separation that we experience. And that's why 99.9% of the time, a baby that comes out of the womb is crying until they come back into contact with, usually it's with the mother. And so that sort of dance between separation and connection is implicit in human life from like the very first moment. And that separation is a core ingredient of suffering, not the only ingredient, but it's a core ingredient. So I would say that suffering is inherent in life, like the story of the Buddha, who was like growing up in this, this royal protected castle. He never really saw or experienced any suffering until he decided to run away one day and came into contact with all of these different types of suffering, the homeless person, the beggar, and that was his first moment of awakening to what's sort of going on in the world. So, but your question, like about is suffering necessary for transformation? I don't know if it's necessary, but I think it can help. I'll give one counter example, though, which is quite important from a client that I used to work with who had experienced just some horrendous traumas, which I won't go into in detail here, but all sorts of horrible things happened. And at that time, I was a bit less experienced as a therapist, and I was trying to hold the frame for this client, a young client, that, you know, there is this thing called post-traumatic growth. You can grow through your experiences and learn from them. And I shared examples of people I'd worked with and seen who did that. But this client felt really like upset by that suggestion and was really pushing against it. And that was a big learning curve for me. I just had to sort of let go of that idea myself because it wasn't helping in this moment, and really just come more into alignment with what this client was actually experiencing and bringing into the sessions. I'm only sharing that just to give a slight
Well, these are
counterpoint, because what
so
would,
often, as so often,
yeah,
nuanced issues. It depends on the context, depends on the situation. So, listeners,
yes,
this book is just packed full of so many insights and tools from Louis' rich and long experience as a practicing therapist and researcher. So there's no way we can get through them all here in the time that we've got left. But do go out, get that book so you can just absorb it all in its own time. It's meant to be kind of mulled over. There's some activities in there as well. So do just take your time with it. There's a lot of material there that kind of needs to sink in. But Louis, just for the rest of the time, I want to spend some time picking out a few of these roots and fruits that are particularly relevant to the research that we've been trying to get our heads around here on the podcast. And in some sense, all 7 of them feed into these 3 things that you mentioned right from the start that kids need to thrive: connection, autonomy, and validation. So we'll come back to that as well. Now, I want to start talking about 2 roots together that I think are connected: virtual reality, the fact that we want to escape our bodies and live in our heads, and anesthesia, that we tend to push down negative feelings. Now, for me, the key to these 2 roots is the symptom of dissociation, which is our tendency to escape from our bodily negative feelings using an emotional avoidance. Now, we can do this in all kinds of ways. You mentioned a few very common ones. Listeners, I'm sure you'll be aware of this: wine, Instagram, retail therapy, certainly 3 in the West that are pretty big, but there are loads of ways that we can do this. Before we get on to one of the main themes of today's chat, kids and devices, the internet, social media, which we've already touched on, give us an overview of this dissociation tendency that we develop as a coping mechanism, and that it's kind of effective at first because it keeps us safe and takes us away from that painful feeling, but becomes maladaptive later on.
Yes. So some feelings are designed to be painful. I think that's the starting point, because they are designed and have evolved to elicit some kind of response or reaction. Like fear, for example, it's not a comfortable feeling. And there's a reason for that, because it's designed to give us a signal that we need to take some kind of action, fight or flight. But culturally, I would say, particularly in 21st century Western culture, we spend so much time in these virtual realities that we've created. In a way, we've created them as a sort of cultural avoidance of having to be with these difficult feelings. And then we also have, and this is changing, by the way, but as a general rule, we prefer happiness over all the other emotions. That's what I talk about in the chapter on anesthesia. As a parent, for example, when your child is upset, it's the most natural thing in the world to want to make them feel better, right? It is just to relieve the suffering of your child is the most natural thing in the world. But actually, sometimes the way that we do that can give a message that we don't want to see sadness, that sadness or fear or shame is not welcome here. So, for example, if a child is sad, we might, I mean, this is not necessarily good parenting, but we might want to show them something on a screen, or we might want to distract them. We might want to offer them something like a sugary treat to help them stop crying. But the message that we're giving to them every time we do that is, this feeling is not something that we want to be with. We want to quickly move on from it. And obviously, then that becomes entrenched over time. And that's what leads to coming back to dissociation, is like we choose these activities as a way to disconnect ourselves from these feelings. So there's a cultural level to it, but the biology of dissociation is I think really important to just acknowledge too, that there is this mechanism within our biology that we call freeze. I'm sure you've covered this on the podcast before, but essentially we have fight, flight, and freeze, and now there's a fourth one, fawn. People talk about fawn, but the freeze response is essentially the body's way of shutting down when we feel incredibly threatened. So it's a way of really shutting the whole body down. And the extreme version of that is when an animal basically pretends to be dead. And there was a great example of this, which I talk about in the book, on a David Attenborough show, where there were these baby lizards who were hatching in this particular spot of desert. But there was all these snakes who were like, it was a really like gruesome episode. These snakes were like lurking around looking for these lizards who were hatching so they could catch them and eat them. And it showed one scene where this lizard was being cornered by this snake and it had nowhere else to go. and it basically just stopped dead and didn't move and went completely immobile and was essentially pretending to be dead. But pretending isn't the right word because it's a literal switch, it's a biological switch, the freeze switch. And then the snake just suddenly couldn't track where this, I think the snakes were blind maybe, but couldn't actually track this lizard anymore. And so it ended up going away, and this lizard was able to escape from this situation. So this is kind of like the extreme form of dissociation where we completely cut off all of our bodily operations, and we're essentially acting as though we are dead. And we see that as a trauma response. So I see that in a lot of people I work with, where if we're talking about some material or we're approaching some material that's very upsetting and feels overwhelming to the system, what can happen is a client will start to completely zone out, and they'll look to the side, they might start rocking. Sometimes it can be really hard to even connect with them. So this is like, I would say that's quite an extreme version, like they go into a completely different dissociated state. But we see like different versions of that in everyday life where you just, it's not always bad, by the way. Like you might just be staring off into the distance. Like I often see that with my daughter, she's just staring off into the distance. And interestingly, I don't know if you find this, Freddie, but when she is just sitting somewhere and just staring off into space, I notice this reaction in myself where I want to like bring her back and like really want to engage with her, because it almost feels like, oh, I don't know why, it just feels uncomfortable. But actually, I have to tell myself that there is a normal version of this that's really healthy for us. Like it's actually being in a human body, and being with all the feelings that it comes with, including boredom, frustration, shame, anger, fear, confusion. It's quite hard. And sometimes I think we actually just might need to, our minds need to get outside of our bodies and be staring into space or being distracted. It's just about how much we let that happen as parents and how much that happens culturally as well.
Absolutely. And maybe this is a good time to mention your view that symptoms like dissociation or anxiety or rage, or sadness that present themselves to help the child cope and process all this stuff that's happening in their life are a type of bodily intelligence that draw attention to the deep root below. And that in some sense, we need to honor and respect that emotional intelligence rather than just shame it, or, as you say, try and distract them from it, or just treat it with drugs, hoping it'll go away and we'll go back to this sort of happiness worship that we've got going on in the West. Tell us about this deeply meaningful call to action that comes through these symptoms, and how you use that input as a catalyst for your clients in your work as a therapist.
Yeah, well, I mean, just coming back to the dissociation example. So with a client that I worked with a few years ago who was going into these quite acute dissociative states in the sessions, my initial response was like feeling really troubled by it. Like I really wanted to like get them out of it quickly, because this person's essentially not communicating with you other than like some like nods and things. It's like they've just completely gone. It's really uncomfortable. But over time, I realized that actually just by normalizing this experience and giving very simple messages that this client was safe in this moment, and then trusting that the client had the inner intelligence, like between us, that we could figure this out. And we ended up developing a number of different tools that weren't something you just get from a manual, but they just happened to be authentically arising from this client and the work we were doing. For example, one of the tools was this thing on themselves, like a little drum beat on themselves. They could bring themselves out of the dissociative state. But what was important about that is that I was finding a way ultimately to be with that experience and the intelligence of it without trying to just dive in and trying to, aggressively change something about that experience. And also, and this is so important to me, Freddie, is just trusting that there is a wisdom present, not just in the symptoms, but also under the symptoms. And the client has like this capacity in their system to find a solution. And I see my job, both the parent and as a therapist, is just creating the space and the conditions and asking the right questions that just allow that natural what I would call wisdom or intelligence of the body to surface. For example, you've probably seen the videos of the polar bear, the polar bear video, the polar bear that gets shot with this anesthetic dart, and then they've recorded the polar bear who's out for the count. And when the polar bear gets up from what is potentially a traumatic experience, they do this massive shaking, like they just go like that. And then they do a massive yawn. And then after a few moments, they just like go off into the Arctic horizon. So
Mm.
that is the body's natural, intelligent way to recover from what is potentially a traumatic experience. So it's just such a big fundamental belief of mine that the body has this natural way of recovering from these things. It just needs the right conditions and support to access that.
Yeah, and the Peter Levine somatic experiencing episode, he spoke about this kind of inherent thing in nature where, animals are recovering from these traumatic experiences on a daily basis. They're constantly being attacked for meat,
Yeah.
and they just shake it off, literally. And that's what we see a lot of humans doing completely intuitively without any guidance. Maybe it's just a built-in emotional intelligence. Now, on the subject of pain avoidance here, you also mention that in some sense our development of resilience, so this adaptive ability to form strategies to survive these experiences, can be part of the problem because it involves escaping our bodies and pushing down negative emotions in the process of developing our mental capacity for self-control and also this sort of social responsibility to show only socially accepted sort of positive behaviors. Is that the full story of resilience, though? Or is there a sort of healthy resilience that comes after the acceptance and the validation of those negative feelings rather than just sort of escaping them and pushing them down?
Yes, I mean, I really like the concept which I borrowed from Jonathan Haidt of, well, he actually got it from, what was his name now? The guy who did Black Swan. Taleb, Nicholas Taleb something. You might know that.
I don't
Anyway,
remember names very well, but that I remember
yeah,
the film. Yeah.
yeah. It's the concept of being anti-fragile, which basically there's different things in the world. Some things are genuinely fragile, like a china teacup, that if you drop it, it breaks. Other things are anti-fragile, which means that they become less fragile by exposure to potentially adverse or difficult experiences. And human beings and human children, I think, should be considered in the category of being anti-fragile, which means they develop and can develop resilience by being exposed, not just thrown into horrendous environments, but being exposed to situations that are potentially challenging, that will bring up feelings, including fear. And as a result of those experiences, they can develop a kind of resilience. The other factor that I really want to mention in terms of resilience is about congruence between parents and children. So, for my charity, A Part of Me, we were researching PTSD in war and children for a new program we're developing. And I interviewed an amazing woman called Rana who grew up in Baghdad in the 1980s during the Iraq-Iran war. And she described to me that she was very aware, age 10, that there was a war going on and that there was bombs being dropped and that life was basically very unsafe. And but she said the thing that she remembered that she believes really led to her struggling more than anything else was the lack of congruence with her parents. So her parents would basically come home and tell her everything's completely fine. Like, yeah, don't worry, it's all completely fine and we're going to be fine, da da da. Whereas she could see in their faces, yeah, basically a daily state of fear or even terror. And she described to me how that lack of congruence really left her feeling quite alone. And she then developed all sorts of, adaptive, not so healthy behaviors to cope with that feeling of being alone. And Peter Fonagy, who's like a great British psychotherapist and researcher into trauma, he's done a lot of studies into the connection between loneliness and trauma. And I love one of his lines is basically something like adversity only becomes a trauma when it's compounded by a sense that one's mind is alone.
Absolutely, and that's influenced Peter Levine as well. He was saying it's actually in the absence of the compassionate other that trauma really lands. Whereas we can actually,
Exactly.
through that emotional intelligence and that bodily intelligence we were just discussing, we have all the tools to process even quite horrific things, but not in isolation.
Not in isolation. That's exactly it. So coming back to the idea of resilience is that children can survive the most horrific situations, and they have done. Like for thousands of years, children have survived these situations, and some have even thrived. But one of the key differences is the fact that they have found a compassionate other, whether it's a parent or somebody else, who's helped them to feel less alone. So I think that's just really there's such an important factor in resilience.
It keeps coming back. We're definitely going to get some of these studies into loneliness into the show notes. So, because we really need to look into this a bit more deeply, don't we? Now, before we discuss the fruit to be harvested here from this tendency to flee into virtual realities, let's talk about something that I really wanted to spend some time on today, that Jonathan Haidt's been spending a lot of time on, that there is now a huge movement in UK to try and come to about sort of smartphone free childhoods. Let's speak about the ultimate sort of escape into virtual reality symptom that's most worrying for parents at the moment, particularly for teenagers: internet, gaming, social media addiction, and the engagement business model that they're based on. And the effect is also being artificially amplified by persuasive technology tools that directly target the nervous system's engagement functionality, which is sort of particularly nefarious in the case of young people because it's not even complete. The frontal cortex used for self-control isn't really fully formed until you're sort of 21, 22. Now, we're going to be doing a whole show, listeners, on the persuasive psychology of persuasive technologies, Louis. So you don't need to go into too much details, but give us a brief overview of why the tech side is having a particularly strong influence for teen mental health at the moment.
I'm trying to think where to begin with this really, because there's so much to it. But
Maybe we
I
could
mean,
start with
go,
the connection with this last point about fleeing into virtual
yes,
reality, the coping mechanism, and how the tech companies have sort of really picked up on they're studying quite deeply the social psychology of this in order to develop
yes,
tools. So,
yeah,
maybe we could start with that connection between the way they've
yeah,
responded to the psychology research.
yes. So we know that these platforms, particularly social media platforms, are designed using particular patterns that hook particular aspects of our brains and biologies, especially the dopamine circuits that are seeking rewards in the future. And we know that a lot of these platforms are designed based on what they learn from gambling machines, slot machines, and it's the variable reward thing that seems to be particularly key, which is that when you go onto a game or a social media thing, you actually don't know what you're going to get. If you knew what you were going to get every time, it would be boring. But the variable reward seems to trigger our dopamine systems, which is about seeking rewards in the future. And the model that I found that is so helpful for talking about this, and parents really appreciate this, and would be a good guest to get on your show, by the way, comes from Professor Paul Gilbert, who's based in the UK, who developed compassion focused therapy. And he's done a lot of study into evolutionary biology and psychology. Essentially, has this three circles model to describe the three main motivational systems of human beings. So there's the red circle, the blue circle, and the green circle. The red circle represents the fight or flight system. Most people are pretty aware of that. The blue circle is about dopamine and seeking reward in the future. It's when we're trying to achieve goals and get things done. And the green system is the parasympathetic nervous system. It's the rest and digest, or the tend and befriend. It's also the system that we need to be in to really connect with other human beings, to feel less alone, and also to process our emotions. So, in therapy and in trauma treatment, we really have to feel a bit more safe to allow us to process some of these experiences. But what's important is you can't be in more than one of these motivational systems at one time. So if you're in fight or flight, you're not resting or digesting or tending and befriending. Similarly, and the red and the blue circles are particularly those systems, those motivational systems that are, I don't know what the right word is, but they are targeted by these platforms. So we talked about the dopamine stuff, but also the fear and the outrage. Like there was a big study that was done on social media. I think it was Yale University last year, studied like over 1 million tweets, and it showed that the tweets that express outrage just go more viral. And it's just another bit of evidence that we know that, these platforms are really designed to just basically, I think it's been described as like a race to the brainstem, right? So they're really designed to hijack our dopamine, like the blue circle systems and the limbic system and the fight or flight systems. And basically, if you imagine a young person spending large parts of their time in those modes and hardly any time in the green system, it's really bad for our health. It's really bad, not just for our mental health, but for our physical health as well.
Yeah, well, it's definitely right at the heart of it. And as I said, listeners, we're going to go deep into this persuasive technology psychology in another episode. Now, we've mentioned Jonathan several times, and Jonathan Haidt, he explains in this new book, The Anxious Generation, how the rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness, that we're overprotecting children in the outside world, cutting them off from these important developmental things that Louis was just talking about, making mistakes in the real world, learning from adverse experiences without constantly being guided by adults. But at the same time, we're underprotecting them online, where all of these stimulus that Louis just described are rampant, and on the contrary, being actually, shall we say, there was a big Facebook scandal about how they were giving 8 times more of those negative posts in order to up the engagement that little bit more. And as we mentioned earlier, that has led, since smartphones kind of basically became pretty mainstream, sort of around 2008, 2009, 2010, and the age has slowly been creeping down. And we see this direct correlation between the jump in teen depression, anxiety, attempted suicide, and as we said, occasionally actual successful suicide. Do you agree with Jonathan that, obviously Zuckerberg has just denied that there's any direct correlation in front of Congress? Do you believe that Jonathan's right when he says there's just no question that tech is at least largely responsible for this insane doubling in the last 15 years of all these terrible things in young people?
I do agree with it. And when people debate the research and the statistics, and there's a huge debate going off at the moment since Jonathan Haidt's book, and there's people who have different bits of evidence that they're trying to say, oh, no, it's not to do with the tech, it's to do with this, that, and the other. I just refer people back to their own actual lived experience. And most parents will say and notice that when their children spend a particular amount of time doing a particular thing on a particular platform, whether it's a game, Netflix, social media, that they notice a shift in their energetic state. And if you're asking them to say, how does your child feel, for example, after they spend, let's say, half an hour walking through a forest or through a park, and how do they seem after they've been playing Roblox for half an hour? Most parents will be able to say that there is a definite difference. So what I try and really encourage parents to do is just, yes, dig into the research. Don't get too confused by the debate that's going on, but also just trust what you're seeing right in front of you. Like really listen to it. And it's not just children, it's also what do we notice in ourselves? Like I notice when I spend time on particular platforms, it has an effect on my mood, has an effect on how I sleep, has an effect on how I want to relate to others, because I'm just as bad as anyone else really, and feeling like these devices just sucking my attention away from connecting with other human beings. So for me, I can agree with Jonathan Haidt on the research, but I don't actually need the research to just be able to be really confident that that the way we use these platforms and the way they are designed is having a negative effect on our children's mental health.
So then, Louis, what's the best approach for parents looking to sort of offset this negative influence without letting their kids miss out on the community and the connectedness that's forming around these platforms and tools amongst them and their friends? I mean, this battle to wean them off at regular intervals of the day is exhausting for parents, and it creates even more tension in already explosive relationships with prepubescent and pubescent teens. I mean, what do you
Yeah.
suggest to your clients? Like, what can we do? What's the best approach?
Well, the first thing to just acknowledge is that it's not easy, and also, we can sometimes lean on these devices to help us, especially single parents, parents who are struggling, who don't have much support. Being able to get your child to play a game or watch TV for an hour or two can be a lifesaver. So I really want to just acknowledge the different sort of context that we are all in and how these things can be helpful to us at some points in time. And they're definitely not all bad. They are definitely not all bad. There are some positive potential benefits, for example, from gaming. Gaming can give children a sense of agency and creativity. And there is the social side of it that we have to acknowledge. But my sort of rules around this are, first of all, don't wait for regulation. Like, I think a lot of parents are sort of waiting for the government to tell them that it's not okay for your child to be doing X amount of hours on Y device or platform. And that might come at some point in the near future. But at the moment in the UK, we don't really even have any clear national advice. Like in America, at least, the National Association of Pediatricians has published advice on how much screen time they think is okay for kids at different ages. We don't even have that in the UK. But my suggestion is don't wait for the regulation to figure out your own solution. We are in a good moment in time where things are changing and it's quite exciting. So, as you said, there's a huge growing movement at the moment about smartphone free childhoods, having schools that are free for smartphones. So, I think things are starting to change and it will start to feel easier for parents to manage this. The other golden rule that I have is basically no devices in the bedroom. So if you look at some of the saddest stories, like Molly Russell's story, who was the British girl who basically her parents ended up taking Facebook, now Meta, to court because they found after their girl took her own life, she was 14, that she'd been looking on Instagram and found like all sorts of methods of self-harm and how to take your own life. And she'd been reaching out to people, but she'd been doing a lot of that in her bedroom. And very similar sad stories keep repeating themselves, where it's kids who go to their bedrooms in the evenings and they're on their devices. They're connected to this like vast online world where they can come into contact with all sorts of things. So I say to parents, like, you might let your teenage child have a glass of wine or a beer with dinner sometimes, depending on your family orientation, but you wouldn't let them take a bottle of whiskey into the bedroom with them. So I think the same thing does need to apply to devices. Yeah, just don't let them have devices in their bedroom after a certain time. Really, I think that's critically important.
Mm.
As parents, like, we really have to be willing to deal with the fact that our children might be upset, the fact that they might be missing out on some things. Like, I've heard parents, in the past say, well, that's their only connection to their friends outside of school. And it is true. But, I mean, I hate to be that sort of fuddy-duddy, but when I was young and I was coming back from school, I remember being so tired after an intense day of social interaction at school that I would go home, lie on the couch and just go to sleep because I was just so tired. Whereas now, what's happening is kids are continuously connected to the dramas of the school day through social media. I had one client, this is quite a funny example, who basically his mum was trying to get him to give her his phone so he didn't have it in the bedroom. But he basically told her that he was doing his headspace meditation on his phone. And then he told me that actually he was, just messaging his friends. And I remember when I was, this is going back, but when I was running this therapeutic school, Freddie, was just when Blackberries were starting to become a thing. And I'll never forget one of the students in our class who was the first one to get a BlackBerry. She came in one day and she was kicking off, like crazily kicking off. And I had a one-on-one session with her later in the day, and I said, like, what was going on? What were you doing last night? She said, oh, I just didn't sleep at all. I was like, why? I said, well, I sleep with my BlackBerry under my pillow. And I was like, why'd you do that? She said, oh, just because, I need to keep up to date with like all the chat that's happening because I'm worried somebody might say something bad about me. So basically, the self-monitoring, the anxiety and the self-monitoring that there are these conversations happening online, like all the way into the evening and sometimes through the night, and kids feel this anxiety that they have to check and monitor in case they're missing out or somebody might say something about them. It's really, it's almost excruciating to think about. But as parents, our role is so important. Like we have to be really clear with our boundaries, and every family is different, obviously, but I think like some things have to be pretty set in stone. And I would just say no devices in the bedroom after a certain time. And then just negotiating with your child and helping them to reflect is really critical as well. So, it might be easier for me as a therapist when I'm working with young people, but I definitely can see that young people are really able to reflect on their experience if you just approach it in a non-judgmental, non-pathologizing way. You're just checking in with them, like I'm just noticing something. Do you notice that, when you've been using your device, you sleep less better and you feel this way? And just being curious about it, helping them to reflect on it, I think is key as well.
Yeah. The fruit from this route of escaping our body into virtual reality, of our minds and our tech, is rediscovering our bodies, right? And particularly our bodies in nature. I think you quote one guy who talked about nature deficit disorder, which gave me had a proper giggle about that one. But it comes back to this inherent intelligence in our body, and I would argue in our mind too, that brings up the feelings and images that we need to experience to get to the root and just kind of integrate it and get on instead of completely dissociating from it. Give us a few examples from your practice of how the body can be used, this fruit, to transform this dissociation and become exactly the counterbalance to the time that we obviously all want to spend on these devices.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm actually really into at the moment, and I mention it in the book, although I've got much more into it recently, is earthing or grounding. Which is basically the practice of being connected through your skin to the earth. And there is some science around it showing that it can reduce inflammation and help sleep and stuff. I personally have found it incredibly helpful. Like if I've had a heavy day, and I do a lot of my work through Zoom, so it's very disembodied ultimately, even though I work a lot with the body, the overall experience can feel a bit disembodied. So I, at the end of a day, will go to my local park and I just take my shoes off and walk around for about 10 minutes. And I'm just feeling my feet's connection to the earth. And I'm imagining that I'm like letting go of some of the like difficult energy from the day into the earth. And what I remember from when my daughter was young, I don't know if you had this experience, but basically, she used to hate wearing shoes. Like wherever we went, she used to kick off her shoes and she just desperately wanted to be barefoot anywhere. So for me, I think that's quite a common thing. And that shows that children are attuned to this like natural need for their feet and their bodies to feel connected to the earth. So it's like this just intuitive, intelligent sense that we're born with about what we need. So that would be one example, earthing. And then the other thing that I'm particularly passionate about is just movement and dance. I know you are too, but for me, movement and dance is just critical to our mental health. And so, for example, in sessions, what I might do, depending on what I'm working with, is if something's feeling stuck, or like we're getting stuck on a particular problem, I might just ask the young person I'm working with just to stand up and start moving a bit or shaking a bit. Like shaking is is a great tool from trauma, the trauma treatment world. And as I said, with the sort of videos that we see of animals recovering from trauma, the big part of it is just literally shaking. And I think that's one of the reasons why we love dancing, because we're sort of, in a way that we don't realize sometimes, we are actually letting go of a lot of unprocessed stuff in our bodies. So movement, dancing, earthing, not sure what else there is. There's probably a lot more stuff around the body.
Well, I just wanted to mention an organization that Jonathan talks about, that also Johan Hari's been talking about for many, many years, regarding sort of issues with attention and disconnection from nature, is getting kids back out into nature unaccompanied, right? And
Yeah.
this feeds into this important point about independence and autonomy that you also fix on in the book, this let grow innovation. I think it's only in the US, but I think it's spreading to Europe now. It's an interesting example of how unsupervised play, often in nature, can be a massive stimulation to the kids' sense of autonomy, get them out of the house, back into their natural environment. Do you recommend these kind of ideas for parents who are, I would say probably rightly worried to leave their children unaccompanied, the way we all used to play, messing about on our bikes around and out and about with our friends? Do you think that an organization like that, with that kind of innovation for sort of facilitating unaccompanied play in nature, do you think that's something that the listeners should look into?
Hugely. And I think it's so important to spend a bit of time looking at the data around whether the world is less safe now. Because when I speak to parents about this, and I talk about the idea of unsupervised play, very often what I'll hear back is, yeah, but especially if I say, well, what was your experience growing up? What were you allowed to do? And mostly we were much more unsupervised growing up. So as you said, I similarly, like age 6, 7, I was like playing on the streets with my friends unsupervised. And then I was like exploring the woods behind our house for hours at a time. And that was from 7 onwards. And yes, I had some accidents and, hurt myself in different ways. But actually, I think that was quite a formative experience for me. When I mention that to parents, they'll often say, yeah, but the world's not as safe as it used to be. Statistically, though, this really depends on where you live. But one of the big things that I talk about in the book is the sort of fear. I think one of the biggest fears is about child abduction. And the backstory to that is like in the 80s and 90s, and then moving forward from that, we had some like major, really scary stories about child abduction that really hooked the attention of parents. And that doesn't mean that the likelihood of abduction has increased, because it hasn't. If anything, it's decreased from what I can tell. But the fear about this sort of thing happening has increased because of the media exposure that these things have gotten. So I think it's really important to start this sort of bit of the conversation about just acknowledging that our fears about the risks to our children, and especially if we think that the world is less safe now, we're probably not accurate in that estimation. So we think part of it is that challenging our fears a little bit.
Mm. So, as I said, listeners, there is just so much in Louis's experience and in this book that's different to the usual parenting psychology outlook. He's been so generous. He's given us all kinds of brilliant, really actionable advice today. I'm not going to try and squeeze any more out here on the podcast, but you must just go and get a copy of How the World is Making Our Children Mad. And please, if you can, donate to his charity, A Part of Me That's Supporting Children to Transform Loss into Compassion. Both of those links will be in the show notes. But it just leaves me to thank you for your generosity with your time and for going into such depth about these complex and often divisive topics with really, really practical, actionable solutions, Louis. I wish you so much luck with the new paperback version of the book and with your ongoing practice. So thank you, Louis Weinstock.
Thanks, Freddie. It's been great to chat with you.